Hi, and welcome to Talking About Teaching Economics. Today is going to be a bit of a special episode. Instead of talking to an instructor, I'm going to be talking to someone who actually spent some time. Well, I'm not sure if it's the real world, but it's definitely outside the halls of academia. My guest today is Roger Sceviour. He's working as a consultant on national income accounts for a variety of countries around the world. So we want to talk to you about what you're doing. Can you explain to people who might not be totally up on this what it is you're doing? And just
Okay. Well, I work in the area of national income accounting. So essentially, I provide assistance, right, or consulting services to other statistical organizations throughout the world, usually the developing world, in their national accounts programs. So it could be things like they're developing, say, a quarterly GDP program for the first time, and they want some advice on how to proceed. What data sources do they use? What methodologies do they use? It could be they're rebasing their gross domestic product to a more recent base year, for instance. It's
okay,
usually it's usually bread and butter issues
right.
in national account statistics. So quarterly gross domestic product, annual gross domestic product, and just improving the methodology
Okay.
that statistical organizations use to be more aligned with international best practices, usually in the form of official manuals,
Okay.
manuals that have been published by the UN or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So the way I got into this right now is before I was doing this private consulting, I was with the International Monetary Fund in Delhi, right? And so yeah, and I was focused on the countries in South Asia, right?
Okay.
So India, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. And I was focusing on these statistical offices in those countries.
Now, isn't it Bhutan that has the National Happiness Index?
They have the National Happiness Index, but it's not really a national accounts. I don't have any expertise in it, right? I don't know. I don't know much about it.
Okay, no, that's
But
cool.
in the few times I visited there, you would always see like posters, like in the
Oh,
statistics
cool.
office that would talk about it. So it was a very big thing.
Yeah, no, I just that was just what popped into my head. It's like, wait a minute,
Yeah,
I've talked about that before.
but nothing that I had expertise on. It's not
So,
core national accounts.
so your focus, GDP is really the heart and
Bread and
soul of what
butter.
you're doing. Yeah.
Bread and butter.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned talking about rebasing to a different, changing the base here effectively.
Yeah.
Now, are most of these countries using chain weighting, or are they still,
No,
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 they're
not many
still
countries.
base here?
I think India was experimenting
Oh,
with
okay.
with the chain linking. No, so the primary method is that you would have your base year, and then you would use various deflators, right,
Right.
to convert from current to constant prices in the years
Hmm.
after the base year. So you use a CPI, you may have a
Right.
producer price index, so various less bears type indices, not
Cool.
chain linking.
I just wondered because it's one of those things that, as an instructor, particularly at the intro level, it's like, do I get into this? And do I get into, because chain linking or chain weighting it's a little more, it's a little more grindy in terms of the arithmetic involved
Yeah,
to teach it
it's
to an
very
intro student.
it's very sophisticated.
Mm,
Uh, I mean the extra data that you need to go from
mm,
a standard last prayers method to a chain linking method is not a lot.
no.
But yeah, most countries don't do it. Like I know it's recommended,
Oh, is it?
and
Okay.
yeah, it's one of these. I guess the international recommendation is to use chain linking.
Mhm.
Uh, but I mean, Canada does, the U.S. does.
Yeah.
Actually, Canada uses a modified Fisher's like type of chain linking. It's even a step past the regular chain linking.
Okay.
But most countries don't.
Hmm.
Like certainly in South Asia, that wasn't the case.
Well, what would be the argument? We're kind of off my questions here, but that's fun. What would be the argument for going to a chain linking versus just a simple base year, deflator approach?
Well, the idea is that you're taking into account the the base year prices,
Mhm.
right, which is your standard last prayers, but you're also taking into account uh, prices in the updated reference period. So it could be
Mhm.
1 year after. So, like, I suppose the idea is you have this sort of floating base year,
Mhm.
right? So you have kind of a pseudo base year or a modified base year when you use the chain linking relative
Mhm.
to uh, the standard last prayers index,
Right.
right? But even then, um, some of the empirical results and empirical studies have shown that it doesn't really make much difference.
I wouldn't
I,
think it would make a huge difference
no,
unless
it doesn't.
something weird is going on.
It, there are circumstances where you could get very large changes in prices, like
Mhm.
particularly oil prices,
Okay.
where
Yeah.
where you could see more of a difference between the standard last fares and the uh, the chain linking. Now, I know there was a handful of countries in Africa that they developed right for their national accounts. They had technical assistance from various countries. I believe France was uh,
Mm.
was heavily involved in this, so they updated to chain linking. I'm not aware, right, of
Mm.
any other countries in the developing world that have
That
really.
have gone that.
And it's not that it's not important. It's that there are bigger fish to fry, right?
Mm.
Much
Yeah.
bigger. I mean, one should have a quarterly GDP program before you get into chain linking. That's
Yeah.
probably more important,
It's
right? So
probably
this is what
important to
happened.
stand. Yeah, it's probably more important to stand than trying to sprint right off the hop.
Exactly.
So you're getting obviously paid primarily by, I assume, by the countries you're working for.
If it's a bilateral contract,
Yeah.
yes.
So why would a country like the you mentioned you were just in the Maldives?
Yeah.
Um, why would they spend the money on you? What are they getting out of this? Why is this important? I'm asking the old
Well,
jackbone question.
right. So
So,
they updated the base. This particular project
mhm,
was on GDP rebasing. So updating the base year
yeah,
from 2014 to 2019. So they were due. So why me? Well, didn't have to be me, right? There are other people in the world that have
right.
this expertise. Uh, but when you hire somebody directly, right,
Mhm,
you would get them full time, like
right.
for like a longer period. It could be a month, it could be
Mhm,
2 months, it could be 3 months, and you can focus on completing this project.
right.
Uh, I mean, these statistical offices are very small.
Mm.
Right? You may get 3 or 4 people
Oh wow.
that run the entire national accounts program, right? So they're
Oh
doing the
wow.
annual, they're doing the
Right.
quarterly, right? They have the production GDP, they have the expenditure GDP,
Mhm,
and 3 or 4 people are handling all this. Now you
wow.
throw in a large project like GDP rebasing, right? That's
Right.
much more difficult for a team of 3 to 4 people.
Hmm.
I was at Stats Canada, the GDP rebasing, but we had maybe 300 people that
Yeah.
worked in national accounts, so you can kind of divide things up. So I guess from their perspective, the advantage of hiring somebody directly is that they can get it done in a reasonable period of time,
Mm.
right? And it leaves them to continue with regular production
Right.
activities.
So I guess that was a great answer, but I want to go a little higher level.
Okay,
Like, so why would we do this at all?
to rebase GDP.
Or yeah, we're fussing about these statistics at
Well,
all.
well,
I'm trying to get you to talk about why GDP is important and that
because
kind of stuff.
it's like GDP is your broadest measure of
Hmm.
economic activity. It's not the
Right.
only measure of economic
Of
activity,
course.
right? There's an index of industrial production, right? There are indicators produced by the conference board, right?
Hmm.
GDP is one measure, but it's a very broad measure, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so I guess you have to get into, well, what is GDP,
Yeah.
right? And I
That was kind of where I was trying.
and
That's kind of where I was trying to lead
yeah, and like
you.
a lot of people don't know, and
Yeah.
well, or you may have an official definition, right?
Mm.
You can say, well, it's It's the value of unduplicated products produced domestically for final consumption.
Oh, unduplicated.
Unduplicated. Yeah.
That's a turn of phrase that isn't in most textbooks.
Yeah, it's unduplicated. So for instance,
Okay.
um, let's take your vehicle, right?
Right.
You bring your vehicle to a mechanic. He looks at your car, he says you need new brakes. Okay. So you say, okay, go ahead. So he has to get the brakes first. He has to order the brakes. So let's suppose he orders the brakes from a Canadian brake producer, right? Uh, so he takes the brakes, installs them on your car, right? You pay the bill and walk away, right? So we want unduplicated. So we can't count the value of the sales of the brake manufacturer and the amount that you spent on the entire car repair. We only have to count it once. So all of these products that are used in the production process to produce other products, they're not to be included.
Right.
It's unduplicated final.
Yeah.
So
So it's
household point of
finals.
view.
Yeah. Finals the more common turn of phrase in the
Yeah.
textbooks.
Yeah.
And I was really intrigued by that turn of phrase.
Yeah.
That's more precise, I think.
Unduplicated. Yeah. They're unduplicated and they're final. But even then,
Well,
I I don't find it a very good definition. Like, what does that even mean? Like, who cares? Like, what does that mean? Unduplicated final.
Sure, why not? I mean,
So when I'm explaining it, I'll say, look, this is basically what it is. Take everybody in the country, right, or in a certain geographic area, and add up their income, right? Their wages and salaries and commissions and tips and the profits from all the corporations and the non-corporations, add them together. Yeah, you have to make some adjustments, right? It's not as simple as that, but basically you do that and you basically have gross domestic product.
Yeah.
Right, because there's three ways to measure it. There's the expenditure approach, production approach, and the income approach. So the income approach is when you add up everybody's income. So that, I think, to me that's clear, because that sounds like national income.
Yeah.
Right? So GDP is essentially national income. Yeah, there's adjustments you have to make, right? But essentially that's it. Now, why is that important? Well, national income is a pretty good proxy of what you could buy in goods and services, right? Without making, a qualifying statement whether those goods or services are bad or not. We're not getting into that, right? The way people choose to spend their money is fine. And it's probably, not far-fetched to believe that there's a correlation between standard of living and the goods and services you can buy with your national income.
Yeah. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. So the rebase here, what's the why is this something, you said the Maldives were due. So, can you explain to us what that means and why you'd want to be doing it every, I think you said 5 years?
5 years is the standard. Like, that's the recommendation.
Yeah. Okay.
Maldives for South Asian countries were the most, I guess, compliant to that recommendation, right? In Canada, the US, et cetera, yes, we do it every 5 years, sometimes even more frequently than that. But I've worked with countries where it's been 15 years out, between updating the base year. Why do we care? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first one is probably not that interesting. We're updating the base year, right? So we're no longer saying this is valued in 2014 prices, it's valued in 2019 prices, right? Okay, that's the easy part. But the more important part is that when you rebase, you also make a lot of other changes. So you may have new data sources that you didn't have before. You may be changing some of your classifications in the national account. So changing your industry dimension or your expenditure dimension, right, in your GDP tables. Or it could be updating your methodology, right, to be more compliant with the international recommendations. Because it's very difficult, although it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to be between base years, right, and making big changes to the way you do things, right?
Mhm.
Like let's take household consumption expenditure, right?
Mhm.
So this is in a lot of countries, it's the biggest component of expenditure side GDP. Okay. So let's say we're in our old base year. Let's say it was 2014, and the way we um, the way we estimate this on an annual basis is we have some data like say the goods and services tax,
Mhm.
right? So we have access to this data, and with this we can come up with an initial estimate,
Right.
right, of household consumption expenditure. Okay, suppose the year is 2017. So we're between our 2014 and 2019. And let's suppose now in 2017, we have a new survey that's been conducted by the statistics office. Let's say it's an expenditure survey, like a household expenditure survey. Um, and you see from this household expenditure survey that in 2017, your level of household consumption is different. Say it was 10% higher,
Right.
right? And you believe that this is a very strong data point, you have a good methodology, et cetera, right? Let's say, hypothetically. So what are you going to do between 2016 and 2017? Are you going to show a 10% increase in household consumption expenditure in your accounts? You can't because it's not real, right?
Hmm.
Because you just have a different data source that you're using and you're
Mhm.
getting a different result. So what one of the advantages of rebasing is you can kind of take that result, you can put it in your pocket, right? And you can wait for 2019 or your updated base year, and then you can re-estimate, right, your household consumption using this new data source, which would be,
Mhm.
say, your survey of household spending,
Okay.
right? So this is the biggest advantage that you're bringing in new data
Right.
sources, and as a result, you're getting improved estimates of
Mm.
GDP every time you do a rebasing. And
Okay.
this is the reason why every time you do a rebasing, you have a revision. You have a revision to GDP. So in
Okay.
Canada, for instance, what is it? What 2 trillion, right? That's our
Right.
GDP.
Give or
So
take.
give or take, let's say 2 trillion, and we do a rebasing. We have new data sources. Say we have new administrative data, and we say, no, we think it was actually 2.05 trillion now.
Right.
Right? That's fine. That's fine.
Mhm.
Right? It doesn't affect the growth rates. Right? It just says the structure of the economy, the size of the economy is a little different than what we said
Mhm.
previously. Not because we did a bad job, right?
Well.
Right. It's because that's the data that we had,
Yeah.
right? So you make your best estimate given your current data sources.
Mhm.
So this is the real reason
Okay. Because
that
I've
countries
been asked by students, one of the questions that comes up, well, if you're measuring and you keep changing the size of your unit of measurement,
oh, you
right?
mean the constant price measures.
Well, yeah, it's like, okay, we're changing the base here. So
Yeah.
now we're measuring in inches, and now we're measuring in centimeters, and then we're going to measure in, footballs next. And it's like, well, what the hell's going on? And trying to explain that to a student
It's improved
is
estimates.
yeah. And so you're using this as an opportunity to bring in. Now, how do you backcast that? Or do
Well,
you?
well, so the standard recommendation is you backcast your main time series and your GDP tables to at least the previous base year. You can go back
Right.
further. So
Right.
let's take Maldives. They went from 14 to 19. So in 2019, they had a revision to their total GDP relative to
Right.
previously published. It was 2%, right?
Okay.
Very normal. So they
Still a 2% change in GDP. I mean, a lot of people
in
in
the
Canada
level,
would be getting excited about that.
yeah. I mean, yeah, here we wouldn't get a 2% revision. But in South Asia, like 10, 12% revision is not that
Oh,
uncommon.
wow.
Right? Sometimes it's negative. In the case of India, it was actually negative, which is unusual, but it could happen.
Yeah.
So the backcast, so yeah, so the recommendation, you go back to at least the previous base year. You can go back
Mhm.
further. Okay, so how do you do this? Uh, well, there's a few different methods, but they're essentially like statistical methods. You
Okay.
could, recompile every year again, all the way back to 2014 with your updated data. You could do that. And there
If you
may
had the
be,
data. Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes you will have a new data series for all years for a particular activity, for a particular industry in the economy, or a particular expenditure side GDP. It's rare, but sometimes you do. And in those cases, you would estimate every single year back to the previous base year, but it's rare. So there's a couple of other time series methods, and I guess methods in between. So there's two extremes. One extreme is you say we're going to backcast all of our individual time series, say value added by industry, for instance. We're going to backcast so that our year to year percentage change at current prices is the same as what we previously published.
Right. Okay. Sure. Why not?
Or a lot of countries. Yeah. I mean, unless you have some data to the contrary, right? Then you could do that. That's one method. Another method is to say, well, we're happy with our level of GDP for the updated base year. We're also happy with the level of GDP in the previous base year, right? For for that particular year. So let's take the 2014, 2019, right? So we have a new 2019. We have our old 2014 at current prices. We could say we're happy with that 2014 at current prices. It's the 15, 16, and 17 and 18 we're uncertain about.
Right.
Whether we're happy about it or not kind of depends on how it was compiled, right? So if you use, I guess, called supply and use tables, right? It's a statistical product. If you use supply and use tables to get that estimate, can we say that estimate is good? Okay, so how do we backcast when we believe both data points? We bring back the time series from the recent year in such a way that we try to maintain those growth rates as much as possible. And secondly, that our revision in the previous base year is zero. Absolutely zero. So we say that number is good. We're not going to change that. So we kind of splice it back in.
Yeah, you're smoothing.
We splice. Exactly. You're smoothing it in. You're splicing it in. You're smoothing it in. Those are the two. Those are the three methods.
Right.
So you have the fixed ratio, where we maintain the old growth rates. You have the splicing method, where we taper it in, and you have the recompilation method, right, where you're basically recompiling for every single year.
Cool.
So in the case of Maldives, we use mostly the splicing or smoothing method.
Okay.
Because we were confident in their 2014 estimate.
Right.
So
you want to try and make the two match up.
No, exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting. So what are some of the big challenges you run into in doing this work? I mean, like, so, and this might be a time to tell goofy stories or whatever,
It's interesting. And I encountered this even when I used to work with Stats Canada, right? Is that like everybody's kind of responsible for a certain area, right? So suppose you work in national accounts in Canada, you may be responsible for, the value added of, say, the energy sector, right? So you're a specialist in this. You compile it every single year. You're very confident in your results. You think it's great, and maybe it is, right? But now we're doing a rebasing, and so the person that's doing that rebasing or the team doing that rebasing may come to you and say, okay, well, I have a revision for you for the value added of your sector. We think it's 5% higher than what you previously published. And I find that's, you kind of get, conflicts there, right?
Right.
And it happened. It's not just, it didn't happen just there. It happened, when I was working with some of these countries in South Asia. It's the same kind of thing.
Right.
People get married to their estimates, right? and they don't want to modify them,
right?
And so that's a challenge. And you kind of have to manage that, because you don't want a situation where, I guess, the stronger personalities, right, in the team, will not change their estimates, and which means everyone else kind of has to, right, to make the rebasing work. Okay. So when you have like kind of like a team that's in charge right,
Mm.
of the rebasing that's kind of removed from the day-to-day production, that helps with that, right?
Okay.
Because you can blame, say, oh, this guy that's doing this rebasing, I don't know what he's doing. He tells me I have to do this, so there you go, right?
Right.
So that's always a challenge, and
Yeah.
you know, for analysts to accept revisions to their industries.
Okay.
Um, and of course, the size of the teams, like, you have 3 people, you have 4 people working in national accounts, right? And
Mm.
sometimes they're also working on the census, they're working on the CPI or the
Oh,
PPI
wow.
team of 3 to 4 people. And like, so how do you manage that? And I guess, some of the risks there is that the project can go on a long time.
Because it's happening on the side of the desk.
Yeah, it goes on like especially if it's, if the kind of support that they're getting is, more sporadic, where, they're visited, for 2 weeks, say, every 3 months, right?
Right.
Which happens, right? And then, all of a sudden you're 3 years later and the project still isn't done. So it's tough,
Oh,
it's really
yeah.
tough to get everybody on the same footing,
Yeah.
and to kind of have a deadline, and like to stick
Mm.
to the deadline, and you have milestones and stick to those milestones. That's very difficult. It's very
Yeah.
difficult. But I think, from my experience, um, when the statistics office hires somebody directly, it helps with some of those issues,
Right.
right? Because if they hired me directly, right, I'm not there necessarily to advise/assist. Well, I'm doing that too, but I'm also there to, let's just get it done too.
Yeah. Let's
Right?
let's do it.
Let's do it. Yeah. So that helps.
So what would be so we talked about some of the challenges. What are some of the big wins or yes moments that you've had in doing this? Because it's such an interesting uh bit of work.
I would say it was the work we were doing in Sri Lanka. Right. So
Okay.
they were rebasing their GDP, and I think it was only 10 years. Right. Well, I mean, the recommendation is 5, so I think it was 10 years. But again, sometimes it's 15. So that one was very important because I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but in the capital of Sri Lanka, Colombo,
Hmm.
they have what's called the port city, right? So basically, they're actually just taking sand, right, and they're sand from the ocean
Right.
in towards their beach, so they're expanding the size of the country. They're
Well, so
expanding the size of
they're
the port.
making new land.
They're making land essentially, right? They're making land. And it's fairly common in Asia. I think in Singapore they do quite a bit of that,
Yeah.
right? But in Sri Lanka it's a massive project, right? It's been going on for quite a while, and I guess their the compilation of their national accounts before the rebasing essentially missed that activity, right? But it's a massive activity. There's a lot of
Well,
capital
yeah.
formation going on, right? There's a lot of employment, a lot of income was generated. So they were essentially missing it. They caught some, but most
Right.
of it. And uh, like because of that, uh, you had, say, other government departments, other government agencies were, perpetually very concerned about the national accounts, right?
Right.
And so you always run like the risk of conflict of interest, right?
Hmm.
Once you have other government departments kind of sticking their nose, which made it much more challenging. Um, and so I would say it was over 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Uh, I was visiting them maybe every 3 months over a 2 year period, and so we finally finished it, right? And so the this activity now of the port project, right, is now in their national accounts. They have a write up on how they did this, and now this can be used as, I guess, a guide, like for other countries in their national accounts compilation that are also doing this, what they call land reclamation.
Right.
right? Because the
Oh, that's
idea is that, especially with climate change, maybe you'll get more of this kind of activity. So
hmm
we need to know how to measure it in national account statistics,
right.
right? And you need to make sure that your methodology, your current methodology, can pick up this activity when it happens.
Well, yeah, that would be huge.
Yeah.
So how now is it? Are you doing it on an expenditure approach when you add it in? Like,
No, production
what are you
side.
trying to catch?
The industry that's producing this is the construction industry, right?
Right.
So normally with construction industry, the data sources are usually not great when you're estimating the value added, say for the
Okay.
construction industry. But a method is, you may have building permits on an annual
Oh,
basis.
okay.
You may have availability of building materials. So if you're a country that imports most of your building materials, you can look at your import data, right?
Oh, okay.
So the problem is, uh, if you have a new project that's happening and the products that are being used to make that project are extremely different than the construction industry as a whole, then
Oh,
using the imports of building materials, you'll miss the activity because
yeah.
you'll miss it, right? So because certainly in the early part of the project, they were getting the sand, right? So you had these companies were getting the sand from the ocean, treating the sand, doing what, right, and like building up these larger and larger and larger sandbanks, and they were adding cement, right? But there wasn't a lot of materials, right?
No, because
Certainly,
it's already there.
it's already there, yeah. So because of
Wild.
this, like if if your methodology is to use the imports of building materials as your annual indicator, then you'll miss it,
Yeah, because you're
right?
not using any.
Yeah,
That's wild. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
yeah,
There's a little bit of forensics almost
yeah,
involved here.
yeah.
Cool.
And so, we had
So
to come up with this new way of estimating it. And, the government of Sri Lanka spent some money to try to collect some data and to come up with a reasonable estimate.
oh, neat. So what was the ultimate? What was the procedure? What did it look like ultimately?
Well, we had, uh, okay, we had estimates of the percentage of the work that was completed, say by year. Like so it was 10% completed in 1 year, then it went to 15%, then 20%, et
Okay.
cetera. So that was one thing. The second thing is that we had an estimate, say, of the market value per square foot of this reclaimed land.
So that's your
Right?
output.
That's the output, right?
Oh,
And
wild.
that's it. I mean, it's not rocket science, really,
No,
right?
but I mean, to sit, well, you have to sit and think, what is it we're really producing?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's so. You mentioned this earlier, and what is it you think that intro courses get really right about national income accounts, if anything, and what do you think that they get really wrong about national income accounts?
Well, I think back to my undergrad. Uh, it was intro to macroeconomics, like they're at the U of R, right? And I think it was a half a day we spent on national accounts. I think maybe it was a day, and I don't really remember much, right? I just that you had your definition of the other measures like gross national income.
Mhm.
Here's a difference between the gross and the net, right? So like it was very basic. Uh, Now, I mean, was it adequate? Let's see. Like I think it would be instinctual to say, okay, this is my area of expertise.
Right.
Therefore, I think people should spend more time learning it. I don't know. I don't know. Like it's a very special. It's a very very specialized subject.
Mm.
So what maybe something that would have been nice is uh like even a course right on national
Mm.
account. I'm not aware of any university that does this,
No.
but
Yeah.
it certainly wouldn't be introductory.
No.
Uh, what I would teach a national accounts course, it was a minimum of a week,
Okay.
right? So we would spend a minimum of 1 week on national accounts. So something like that, where you take
Mm.
maybe 3 days, right, to go over the basics. Okay, you got your definitions of gross domestic product, but we didn't get into anything on the compilation. Okay,
Right.
great.
Where does this number come from?
Yeah, where does it come from?
Yeah.
What are your data sources? Like to go
Mm.
through a few exercises. It's like here are your data sources. Let's estimate value added by industry. Let's estimate expenditure side GDP, right? And
Mm.
let's reconcile the two together. Uh, I think in 3 days, right? In 3 days, you could do an exercise like that.
Mm.
But of course, that will come at the expense, right, of something
Oh,
else
yeah.
in the course. But that would be helpful. Uh, I know when I started in national accounts, right, I was new. I was totally
Mm.
new to the subject. Yeah, I had my introductory half day, but I learned it all there, right?
Right. So it's on the job.
Totally. Yeah, I
So
don't know.
yeah,
Are other
no,
countries
that's
different? I'm not sure.
yeah. Well, I know, and I can tell you for sure in the Canadian context, it's still
Half a
at
day kind of thing.
at most a chapter.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's just lost because it's so easy to skim over because you want to
Yeah,
get into sort of the bigger
the
ideas.
theory, the supply and demand, and the
Yeah,
ISML curve, all that stuff, right?
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. But
No,
it's so different. It's so different than the rest of economics, right? It's
yeah.
accounting. It's accounting.
Really, yeah. I was gonna tease you about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
accounting.
so the last question. What is it you want instructors to know about the national income accounts? Maybe not that they're going to teach all of it, but what do you think an instructor coming in to do this for the first time, to do an intro course for the first time, should know about national income accounts so that they're well situated you know, to make that half day productive?
Okay. Well, I think it would be helpful, to be aware of all of the official manuals
Mm,
in national accounts. So where does all of this come from? So students can have a reference because there are
mm,
official manuals. There are many official manuals on national accounts. So I think an instructor that is aware of these, right,
mm,
and can say, this is where all of this comes from, these manuals, and at least to provide students with the location, right, or a link to
right.
these manuals, that would be very
Okay.
helpful.
Okay.
Uh, I think
Write that down.
I think something else uh, that gets missed, not talked about very much, is the purchasing power parity, national income accounting numbers. Those are very interesting. We don't talk about them much.
So, you mean the international comparisons?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
so you have GDP of Canada measured in Canadian dollars. We have GDP in the US measured in US dollars. Okay, great. So you convert the Canadian dollars to American dollars. So now you can compare Canada and the US, but the cost of living is different, right?
Hmm.
So when you use the purchasing power parity form, you attempt to control for that cost.
Right.
So for instance, a thousand US dollars uh, in say Washington, right, doesn't buy you the same number of goods and services as a thousand US dollars in southern India,
Right.
right? You get a lot
Yeah.
more goods and services for
Oh,
a
yeah.
thousand dollars in southern India. So the official national accounts do not take that into account at all,
Right.
right? So like I think to get more acquainted with purchasing power parity, how it's
Okay.
compiled, and why this is very important when you're using GDP to try to estimate the standard of living of a country's citizens, right?
Mm.
You want this purchasing power parity because you get big differences. Like a
Oh,
country
it's
like it's very large.
yeah, huge swings.
Yeah, yeah. You get a lot of compression, right? So you get a lot of, richer countries based on, say, just GDP per capita fall significantly when it's purchasing power parity. Like Switzerland,
Right.
for example, it falls very hard. And you have countries like Russia, right, that are ranked very, very small and just total GDP per capita. You go to PPP, all of a sudden they're a top 10 economy again.
Yeah.
I think I saw something the other day. I think they just passed Germany in total GDP at purchasing power parity.
And yeah, it's just wild to see
Yeah,
those differences pop
yeah,
up. No,
yeah.
that's excellent. Well, thank you very much, Roger. It's been a pleasure. This has been Talking About Teaching Economics, and today's special episode guest was Roger Sceviour.
Thank you very
Till
much,
next
Jason.
time.
Have a nice
Okay.
day.
Cheers.